All right, so I've got Rachel Vaughan here who's been lucky to give us her time. So thanks very much, Rachel, for coming.
Good to be here, Dale. Thank you for spending the time with me.
Awesome. Thanks for getting in touch with me too. I really appreciate that. So
Yeah.
I think your story's pretty pivotal at the moment, as there's been a lot of interesting flow with what's been happening in this country. So I think it's a pretty crucial story. So I'd just suggest anyone that hasn't seen your stuff, I think you did I think at the 2018 International Tribunal, is that correct?
That's right. Yep, the ITNJ International Tribunal for Natural Justice, and I've also had an interview with Sean Atwood and various other people. Yeah, Max Egan, of course, his channel got taken down, so
poor Maxie,
that one hasn't gone up again.
Yeah, and your brother's also done his testimony on there as well, so if anyone wants to see that. Yeah, awesome. Yeah. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your story growing up with satanic or Luciferian ritual abuse and based in Adelaide in Australia?
Yep. So I grew up in Adelaide, South Australia, in a suburb called Edwardstown. My father, Alan Maxwell McIntyre, had various jobs, but his main job when I was growing up was as a wiretapper for Telecom. And he also variously described himself as a special friend of police, a whistleblower, and an informant on corruption to police. He had a lot of friends. The satanic ritual abuse was in various forms, so it was intertwined with Freemasonry and MK abuses. And if anybody's familiar with the MK system, they'll often go for families that have a military background, so grandparents or parents that have had some sort of military background. So both my grandfathers saw active service. My paternal grandfather was in 2 wars, survived 2 wars. My maternal grandfather was in the Coral War.
Yeah.
So when you've got intergenerational trauma, for some reason, these sickos that like to experiment on people, the MK bunch, they seem to go for the children, the progeny of people who've gone through that sort of intergenerational trauma. So my father was also a Navy reservist. It's really interesting, though, I cannot find any of his Navy records. I've applied through Freedom of Information and I can't seem to access his Navy records for some strange reason. Nothing.
And what period did he serve in the Navy?
So just as a reservist, I know he was a marshal, but I'm not really sure. I mean, I remember going with my mother to see him off, not to see him off, to go and see him. He wanted to show us one of the ships. And I remember going on there, and I was quite young, maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8. Everybody knew him. Everybody spoke to him by name. So he obviously, was actually going out on the ships.
Yeah.
Just can't seem to get access to any of his records. And people have told me that's because he was in, the special elite unit where they don't have records.
Yeah.
And I've applied to ASIO for his records too, but they've not given them to me. So I'm going outside of the ASIO channels and looking elsewhere. So to get back to the satanic ritual aspect, that I was usually drugged for those practices. It wasn't something they did every weekend, but there would be parties. There was often a lot of build up to it. There was one particular ritual that I was taken to as a 14-year-old where I was taken out to buy a special dress, and just so much rigmarole leading up to it. The dress had to be a special black and white dress, just crazy stuff. Some of it I was drugged for, other times I'm not so sure that I was, but there were certainly elements which a lot of people would find very difficult to believe. And this is the problem with satanic ritual abuse. You start to try and talk to people about it and they find it really difficult to understand or accept. That's one thing about this situation that we're seeing at the moment that is of benefit to me, as horrific as it is for the masses to have to wake up to this sort of activity and believe that it actually happens. Yeah. At least it vindicates what people like myself, Fiona Barnett, my brother Andrew, and many, many others have said in the past, that this stuff does actually exist. it's interesting, we have so many religions that believe in these things, but in these Western societies where we live, it's like, oh no, it's a taboo subject, you cannot talk about it, and if you do, psychology will put you somewhere. You know, it's very hard to
like that doctor that was speaking out again about the hydroxy treatment, and then she came out with some witch doctor sort of stuff, and then they tried to bash her, but like,
yeah,
that's sort of common knowledge in Africa, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just because psychology has such a huge grip on Western societies doesn't mean that other people don't have different beliefs. And esoteric beliefs are more common around the world than the, you know, the squashing down that psychology does on anybody who has any kind of spirituality. Yeah. We're dumbed down. We really are dumbed down here.
So speaking of psychology too, I've heard you say that you were being groomed for a certain position within the cult that you were part of. So can you explain like how, not just for you, but how it goes into generational and why they groom people for specific roles, whether it be, you know, media, army, psychology, academics, and what
so that's
was to be.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was being groomed to be a psychologist. I was groomed from fairly early on to go into that role. I had a family member who was a psychologist. This seems to occur in particularly the cult family the cult families that my father was involved with, had a lot of involvement with media, especially. So I've got family members who are media people. It's a way of controlling each member. So if you survive your childhood, if you're not sacrificed, or you don't suicide or run off and, you know, disappear some other way, you'll be mentored into these roles so that they can still control you, and obviously compromised. So the method is severe trauma, being told that if you ever speak out, someone that you love will die, or you will die, or your pets will be murdered, and I've had that experience. Threats. And then if you survive all of that and you're still, you know, obviously you have to be under some sort of control, then they'll mentor you into a position where if you ever speak up, you will lose that position. So it's lots of threats from lots of different angles. And of course, always the threat that if you speak up, if you do survive, you will lose your whole family, which is pretty much what's happened to me. I've got a couple of siblings, but apart from that, everybody else is on. I've got younger family members who I'm still in contact with, but my other siblings, a lot of the family members are now estranged from me because I dared to speak up. A lot of them are still stuck in the positions that they were mentored into, and I can see why they're not speaking out, but it doesn't help.
Yeah, and look, from just hearing so many different victim stories, and it's the same that everyone gets, isn't it? That, you know, you speak up and you're dead, and then there's sort of programming that goes in with it as well. But you mentioned media, so I've heard you talk about Channel 9 before and being involved in child pornography, as sick of that as that is. But you know, like I've heard this as well through Raina Michelson's story with other network studios as well. So this is another theme that and then of course with, you know, stories like Savile in the BBC where stuff was happening there as well. So do you want to explain a little bit about media involvement or what happened with Channel 9 when you were a child?
Sure. So as a small child, I was taken to what I assume was must have been a studio. I mean, there were Channel 9 people there, so I just always assumed it was Channel 9 studios. And I have had people tell me later, well, that would have been so-and-so studio in so-and-so location, and it was Channel 9. There were sound booths. I was abused by a very, very well-known radio personality in one of the sound booths, and I could see out the window, and I could see the back of my mother's head and a family member keeping her distracted. She couldn't hear me screaming. So that happened. And then shortly after that, I was taken into a different booth and filmed whilst I was being abused by someone in a Humphrey Bear suit, which is just charming.
Wow.
Now, I've actually know people, and I didn't remember it at the time, but it did trigger me. Someone actually told me when I was 18 that they had seen, after I'd shown them baby photos of myself, toddler photos, because I was about 3 when it happened, that they had seen footage of someone that looked just like me being abused by someone in a Humphrey Bear suit. Now, at the time, I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't accept it. But so that footage is floating around somewhere. Now, shortly after that, I was forced to walk around with someone in a Humphrey Bear suit at my former childhood home in Macklin Street, Edwardstown, because we had a family member who was involved with Channel 9. I didn't want to be anywhere near this person in this suit. I was absolutely petrified. And that's part of the MK Ultra thing. They will do something horrific like that to you, and then they will reinforce it later on.
Nice, yeah.
And I believe that part of that was also so that I would have memories that were supposedly pleasant of being with Humphrey.
Yeah.
Wasn't pleasant.
Yeah, and look, and after reading Kathy O'Brien's story many years ago, and that was how she sort of got put into the MK Ultra program as well, was through her father was doing the film and child porn, and they got recruited through that sort of stuff as well too. So the other one I was interested in, so I've asked you before about the tunnel network. I know you've been abused and you've been down into some of these tunnels as well. So do you want to explain a little bit of that? Now, in my local area, can you also mention about how they mark some of these tunnels above ground? What key markers?
Right. So if you look at the boundary lines, so if you go onto something like the SAPA map, SAPA map, SAPA.com, SAPPA, you'll find that there are these fat blue lines all over the SAPA map in the topographical view. And they're the boundary lines of the suburbs. Yeah. Now, some of these boundary lines are very strangely shaped, and you've got to wonder, why would they be shaped that way? Now, some cartographers have explained to me that a lot of that is because there used to be water courses or natural cleaves in the land, some way that, it was an obstruction. Now, as Adelaide got built up, those obstructions or those waterways were built underground, and I know that for a fact because basically from my research, which is extensive, and I've been helped by some really quite amazing, beautiful people. No money has changed hands. They've just helped. There was my grandmother used to live in Panorama, and my brother remembered there being a creek out the front of the house, and that was, I think he said in the 50s or 60s, turned into an underground tunnel. And he remembers the size and shape of it. It was one of the walkable sort of sized tunnels that would take the water away, so he couldn't get the creek anymore. People have told me about similar situations in, gosh, I've got to get my suburbs right, but in the eastern suburbs, someone's told me a particular location where that happened as well. And these always, well, a lot of the time they'll correlate to these boundary lines. So if you look at the SAPA map and look at the boundary lines, you've got a pretty good indication of where there may be an underground tunnel. Not all of them are walkable. Also keep in mind, terraces and avenues tend to be the ones where they put the 1.5 metre stormwater tunnels, which are small. You can't walk through those. So you'll get, for instance, on St Lawrence Avenue in Edwardstown, just near to where I grew up, that's where one of the stormwater lines is. It doesn't run along Macklin Street where I grew up.
Right.
So the tunnels that I used to walk through, which I only ever accessed via a bunker beneath my father's former home, or my former childhood home, those tunnels were completely different to the stormwater tunnels. There were stormwater tunnels that were rather large and that had the smaller 1 metre tunnels going into them. But the ones that were nearest to my home, they were built in the 1938 mandate for tunnels and trenches to be built in just prior to the Second World War. Yeah. And the reason they were built in that area is because there were already a whole series of kilns, old terracotta brick kilns from the Wunderlich's terracotta tile factory, which is on the corner of South Road and Cross Road. Those kilns were quite large. So when the mandate came, around 1940, when all of the clay had been exhausted in the area and all of the kilns were built at a lower level because the clay had been dug out, and they built the kilns at that lower level because the clay had been removed. They then brought soil in and brought the whole suburb up to the normal level with all the other suburbs around it, covering up the kilns, and they were turned into bunkers. Well, they were used to cold stores, that sort of thing. And then when that mandate came in prior to World War II, they were turned to bunkers. So that just required basically concrete rendering up the sides of the kilns and a concrete floor, and they had to be serviced with tunnels. So they had a 160-strong workforce in Wonderlicks at that time. The mandate was that every house, every business, every meeting place had to have a tunnel, trench or bunker within 20 feet of the back door. So when you think about that, this is all of Adelaide's absolutely crisscrossed with these things. There's a brilliant thesis on it written by Martin Wimmer called Gimme Shelter. Well worth reading, because I think there was 11,000 feet of tunnels and trenches dug in the Adelaide CBD alone during that mandate. So a lot of tunnelling. And they say now that the tunnels can't be found, but they'd still be there. They're just hidden.
Well, I find that very interesting, especially when you said about the terraces, because I know in my hometown there's an old girls' boarding home and an old boys' Catholic boarding home, and they both run along terraces. Okay. I've actually had friends that have snuck down into the tunnel system there. It's supposed to go to the church, an old military facility, and the hospital as well, I've been told. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when you told me that, I thought it's very interesting. It's an old mining town too, so there's tunnels everywhere.
Yeah.
So can you explain some of what you've done with your allegations over time and the trouble that you've had to get your story out? I mean, you don't have to go into all. I've heard there's many allegations, but maybe a little bit about the Mulligan inquiry and the cover up of the child trafficking.
Yeah, okay. So thousands and thousands of people came forward for the Mulligan inquiry. That started in 2007, and 922 perpetrators were named. That was all suppressed. All those names were suppressed. We are not allowed to know who they are. As I've said before in interviews, 13 were charged. 13 were investigated, only 2 were charged and actually incarcerated over it. So of 922, you've got 2 that got put away. It's just disgusting. The only reason why the inquiry was put into place in the first place was because of the decades of people screaming out for it. And I know how well South Australia will cover these things up. I've been working since, well, it took me from 2006 to 2016 to ever have my father even interviewed for my abuse. And that took, I had Anne Bressington meet with me in 2008. She couldn't get anything happening. I had Robert Brokenshire interview me. So these are members of parliament here. Yeah. He tried to get something happening. He couldn't get anything happening. It wasn't until I found the right member of parliament in 2016 that I actually got an investigation to take place. Then, of course, my father died in 2017. I wrote form letters, what I describe as form letters. So in 2006, when I started making allegations and I kept getting treated just the most appallingly, just dreadful treatment from South Australian police. I tried going through the Police Complaints Authority. Oh, my God. They were disbanded in 2009. That's one of the most corrupt departments I've had to deal with, and I've had to deal with all of them. And I've gone through the ICAC. I've gone through the OPI. I can't talk about what happened with the OPI because it's a $30,000 fine to even discuss it.
What about the federal police too? Is it a federal case as well?
I've gone to the federal police. They won't touch it. I went to Task Force Argus way back. I think it was probably 2008. They wouldn't touch it, but because apparently they don't work with South Australians because they're in Queensland. They're a pedophile task force over there. But it involved a man. My father was involved with a man who was over in Queensland, and they were involved together in the abuse. But they wouldn't touch it. They've collaborated with South Australian police since on other cases, but they wouldn't do it for our case. Something very special about my father. And I don't think it's necessarily to do with the pedophilia either. I think it's more to do with the medical experimentation that was going on with those tunnels and possibly a dump in the area, because I was taken to a multi-level facility, an underground facility, as a 10-year-old. And I won't go too far into it, but there were some other things that happened in that multi-level facility throughout my childhood. And the way that I arrived there was so convoluted, I could never work out where it was, but I think it's quite close by. So I did some investigation probably about a year and a half ago, just looking on Google Maps. It's amazing, or Google Earth. Look around on Google Earth in Adelaide and you will find Freemason symbols everywhere. And there is the craziest condor-shaped symbolism around the Adelaide airport.
Yeah.
I can't remember. John Mitchell Reserve is the eye of the condor. So if you look up John Mitchell Reserve, you'll see an eye, and then you'll see the streetscape shaped like a condor's head. And if you just keep going down, you find the wings. Underneath the wings is Adelaide Airport. My father used to make jokes about thunderbirds every time an aeroplane went over, and I found myself with the misfortune of spending time in the backyard with him, and an aeroplane went over. Now, underneath that condor's wing is also an Illuminati symbol, an Illuminati eye within the streetscape. Opposite that is a rising sun symbol at the northwestern corner of the Adelaide Airport. I'm not even trying to hide this stuff. It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's unbelievable when you open up to it, isn't it? It's like the Denver Airport stuff and just the Canberra layout and Washington.
Oh, Washington is fantastic. Yeah, Canberra's got an owl in the streetscape. It just, you know, symbolism will be their downfall. It is their downfall, and it's becoming their downfall.
And do you know what you're saying was the symbolism now too? It is becoming, people are becoming aware of it, which is quite nice. And you can't hide
awesome.
that. You've been putting it in our face.
No. How much of a tinfoil hat wearer can you be if you have nothing to do with civil authority, but you can see it and everybody else can see it? It's not hard to prove. So I mean that's been cathartic in a sense. You know, as much as it's weird watching all these Save the Children marches. I'm overjoyed.
Yeah.
Because finally what I've been saying makes sense, and I'm not the crazy person anymore because everybody's waking up to it.
Yeah.
But it's coupled with this, you know, pit of the stomach anxiety and fear that we're being led into something really, really scary at the moment, and we have got to fight against it.
Yeah.
You can't just walk into this, people. You've got to realise that we are living through another Nazi Germany situation.
Yeah.
It's not going to go away.
See, that's what I wanted to ask you too, Rachel, because obviously with the going through trauma-based mind control yourself, now that can happen on a severe level with the sort of ritual abuse that you've went through, but it can also be subtle as well, can't it, on the collective through media. So like I'm seeing it a lot now, but like for someone like yourself, how much of a ritual aspect are you seeing with what's been pumped out with the media, with the numbers, the way that the abuse of children, the way that children are being traumatised through this situation, babies having their mothers who've got their mouths covered? It's disgusting psychological trauma, isn't it?
It is. It's disgusting. Yeah. Look, I was subjected to the still face experiment. The still face experiment. So Max Egan was discussing it the other day, and I burst into tears when I was watching it. They've got a baby interacting with its mother. The baby's in the high chair, the mother's in front, just interacting with the child, smiling, laughing. And then the mother sits there with no expression on her face and just stares at the baby. And the baby goes through the worst trauma, because it's like looking at someone that's demonic. Just because the mother's face is still, she doesn't have to pull a face and make it scary. It is terrifying for that child. What we're going through with the face masks is really not that different, except it's for everybody.
Yeah.
It is a massive psyop. I think and that again, you know, it's that bittersweet thing. People are waking up, but children are being traumatised en masse at the moment. This is huge. And it's not just the trauma of wearing a mask and seeing everybody fearful and listening to mum and dad talking about being scared of vaccines and all of those things.
Yeah.
And not wanting to know about the future, not knowing what's coming, not having the certainty of even being able to go to school on a daily basis. It's having everything that they've ever used to just torn away from them. It's cruelty on a massive scale. Honestly, the people who are running the system, they don't deserve to be here. And I should say that. I'm not going to say any more, but who deserves to be here and who doesn't deserve to be here? Children are innocent.
Yeah.
They deserve not to live in this sort of system.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and yeah, it to me, it just appears satanic to me, and it near makes me cry just thinking of the development, that, you know, destroying the development. I've seen some young kids, and it's horrible to see. So anyway, I won't keep you too much longer, but I know there's also been a real sort of knowledge that's coming out at the moment, and the explosion of interest, especially around Bill Heffernan's speech that came out in 2015. Now, I've been sharing this video since the day it came out. No one wanted to hear about it, but it is going around like wildfire at the moment.
It is, yeah.
And so if you just end on a note where maybe you could explain a little bit about the 2015 one. It's a bit like the Mulligan one as well, it's connected to the Woodrow Commission. I know that's not to do with you, but the same order was put on these documents as well. So what do you think first about the explosion of interest? And it's hitting a peak point now where half the population's seen that video and is aware of it now. So
yeah, it can't be hidden anymore. No. And kudos to people like yourself who bring it into people's the forefront of people's mind. People like Karen Brewer, Max Egan, all these people are all working away in their own sections, waking up the masses, and that's massive. I've watched the speech so many times, it's ridiculous, and I don't know how anybody could watch that and not feel immense pain for Senator Heffernan, because I already feel like he put himself in an enormous amount of danger, and it didn't make any difference, and that breaks my heart. But he did a big service to people. So when everybody's watching that, they can see that all those people that should have been sitting behind him were missing. He was doing it on his own.
Yeah.
That screams corruption. And you ask yourself, I think everybody's seen Karen Brewer's videos. Everybody knows now who was missing. Where were they? Why weren't they there? They should all be asked those questions. They should be going out and speaking to people and saying why they weren't present. What was your excuse for that day? And I'm sure we'll get all sorts of lame excuses. But we need to know why they weren't present. What were they scared of? Who were they protecting? Who was being protected by that? The only way that we're ever going to get those names uncovered is if everybody wakes up. Yeah. It has to be huge. And I think a big reason why we're going through the PSYOP at the moment is because everybody is waking up. People were questioning things and have been for years, and it's getting to that critical point where you can't shut people up anymore. We know too much. Yeah. Hence, we're living in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, the stamp down's coming and the truth's coming out at the same time, and it's this crazy belt. But credit to Karen Brewer, because she's been rallied the troops, hasn't she?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Seeing her in a tinfoil hat the other day, I love that lady. It's such a great laugh over that.
The other day when she was, the cops came to her door.
Yeah, I didn't hear much about that. I've been a bit slack on social media lately, so yeah.
This is like
cool. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just great. She just gives them an education and sends them on her way.
Good on her.
Yeah. All right. Well, I won't keep you too much long, but I really appreciate you talking to me, and hopefully that, you know, people like you, that you're going to see truth within your lifetime, and that's what we're working towards. So thanks.
Seeing enough of it now. It's made it worth it.
Awesome.
Thanks, Dale.
Thanks, Rachel.